The Lavender Green's response to the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights should make it obvious to America that the transgender agenda is in fact a misogynistic crusade against women's rights. Read the full declaration for yourself and you'll find a comprehensive, straightforward list of concerns and articles focused on combating male violence against females, promoting female access to athletic opportunities, protecting females' right to peaceably assemble and access single-sex spaces, and preventing the medicalization of children's gender nonconformity, among other things. Nowhere in this declaration are people who call themselves transgender smeared, threatened, or ridiculed, nor is it suggested they should be denied the same access to employment, housing, civil rights, and basic medical care the rest of the population deserve. In fact, transgender-identifying individuals are minimally mentioned in the Declaration, and even then only in the context of addressing how their demands violate women's pre-established sex-based rights to single-sex spaces. Once again, the transgender activists haven't actually explained how women's rights threaten self-identified transgender people. They haven't explained why women having the right to get together in female-only spaces, or having their biological capacity for reproduction acknowledged, or having their own prisons and shelters and sports teams is a violation of trans-identified people's civil and human rights. And they're never going to explain it because women's sex-based rights do not stop trans-identified people from accessing employment, housing, food, water, and medical care. Women's sex-based rights simply remind the transgender cult that femininity is not womanhood, and that men who perform femininity are not women. A man who calls himself Margaret Elizabeth, co-chair of the Lavender Caucus, released a brief video statement on YouTube meant to update interested parties on the feud between the caucus and the Georgia Greens. This man, with his shaved head and heavy makeup and unnatural colors, is the perfect example of how ridiculous and how transparent trans activists, particularly male trans activists, are when they pretend they're the vulnerable ones fighting for justice in the American political scene. Without ever once addressing the actual points made in the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights, he claims that the caucus's only goal is queer liberation. What that means, why it conflicts with women's sex-based rights, and how actual gay men and lesbians are included in said liberation, we will never know, because the man and his fellow caucus members aren't going to explain. This refusal to actually explain why women's sex-based rights and protections threaten men who want to walk around wearing makeup and feminine clothing, this falling back on vague rhetoric about fighting so-called transphobia and promoting trans rights, is consistently how trans activists respond to women who espouse even the most basic feminist positions. The Lavender Caucus doesn't want a discussion with the Georgia Greens, just an apology and submission to the trans activists' will, because their problem isn't some mysterious threat to men and women in drag lurking in the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights. Their problem is women having rights and protections at all. Their problem is female and lesbian boundaries that shut out men in any way, shape, or form. Their problem is feminism itself. Feminists' real problem with electoral politics in the U.S. and elsewhere are men and male-identified women, dominating parties and therefore controlling legislation. The Lavender Caucus and National Green Party's response to the Georgia Greens are just the latest example of men attempting to exert their control of whatever party they belong to and use their power to prevent women from maintaining the bare minimum legal recognition and protection. Electoral politics continues to be heavily male-dominated everywhere, with female politicians composing a minority of U.S. Congress, along with state and local governments. We can't even say much about the women who do make it into political office, as they are virtually all male loyalists and only willing to advocate for women and girls to a point. The Democratic Party has made it clear they're siding with transgenderism in a predictable move consistent with our two-party system's habit of simply boiling down every political issue to blue versus red. The Republicans may denounce transgenderism generally speaking, but they do it for their own heterosexist, misogynistic, and anti-homosexual reasons. In both parties, it's clear who's calling the shots: the men. If gender identity and the corresponding erosion of sex-based rights and protections for women have the complete support of men in the Democratic Party, the women won't object, both because they must selfishly look out for their own re-election, and because they don't want to attract the kind of male anger, harassment, and rejection that gender abolitionist women have been experiencing online and in person over the last several years. We must also acknowledge that female politicians arrive to their offices with the male values, internalized sexism and misogyny, and anti-homosexual prejudice they harbored throughout their lives beforehand. They're no different than all the other women in society who follow men's lead, and we can't expect these female politicians to raise their consciousness in a feminist direction once they're embroiled in the dirty world of male electoral politics. I don't know if it's realistic or useful to suggest that radical and lesbian feminist women attempt to become politicians themselves, or to form a party that might be recognized in some official way. The powerful men who control electoral politics would never recognize a radical feminist or even women's-only party with gender abolitionist views on U.S. ballots or in Congress. The Green Party itself hardly has much pull on a national front, and it is a well-established third party. Rather than start a new party just for liberal women who reject gender identity dogma, it would be much easier for some of those women to run for office as Democrats. Though their odds of winning now, should they openly defy the trans cult, aren't that great. The Georgia Green Party choosing to adopt the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights is a bold, important move in the American political landscape, even if it won't get much press compared to whatever goes on with Democrats and Republicans. We have women to thank and respect among the Georgia Greens who have set an example for other female politicians in this country, present and future. That we as women even have to consider creating a new party for the sole reason of asserting biological sex as real and the basis of female oppression is insane. These facts were universally acknowledged and accepted a mere 10 years ago. Now they're considered radical when they couldn't be further from it. The truth is that everybody knows the difference between males and females, including the liberals who pretend the difference no longer exists or is determined solely by individual identity. Very few adults genuinely believe that changing your appearance or your name or your pronouns literally changes your biological sex. So when we argue over that ridiculous idea, we're ultimately wasting our time and energy because we can't convince our political opponents of something they already know is true deep down. The real issue is what fuels the concept of gender identity in the first place. The heterosexual, anti-woman, anti-homosexual worldview of how men and women should be different and unequal. The problem did not begin with transgenderism, but with gender itself, which is rooted in heterosexuality and misogyny. We can't isolate transgenderism from its roots and eliminate it. We must deal with the misogyny, the heterosexual dynamics, and the anti-homosexual prejudice that has been rampant in the human species for thousands of years. Only when female politicians show up to office with that agenda will we have any hope of making real progress as a sex. Only then will this feud over women's rights and gender identity come to an end.